A billionaire CEO thought nobody could outsmart him at chess. He mocked his employees, bragged about his victories, and laughed at anyone who dared to challenge him. But when the janitor stepped forward, just 3 moves later, the entire company watched the unthinkable happen. The janitor's challenge. 3 moves? You think you can beat me in 3 moves? The CEO's voice thundered across the grand corporate lobby, bouncing off the marble walls and high glass ceilings. His name was Richard Grant, a billionaire mogul whose empire stretched across industries, from tech to real estate. To his employees, he was untouchable, untamed, and unbearably arrogant. Richard thrived on power, not just the kind written in contracts or bank accounts, but the kind that made people bow their heads and avoid his gaze. He had everything: mansions perched on cliffs, cars that cost more than most people's homes, and influence that stretched into politics. But none of that gave him as much pleasure as his favorite pastime: chess. Richard believed chess was a reflection of life itself. Strategy, power, control, and most importantly, superiority. He never played for fun. He played to dominate, to humiliate, to remind people of their place. That afternoon, in the center of the company's gleaming headquarters, Richard decided to put on a show. A chessboard sat on a mahogany table, right in the middle of the lobby where employees came and went. He leaned back in his leather chair, calling out challengers like a king demanding tribute. One by one, executives, managers, even interns tried their luck, only to be swiftly defeated. Richard crushed them mercilessly, laughing as he trapped their kings and swept their queens from a board. Each loss was another bruise to their pride, but nobody dared walk away. Not when the boss was watching. "You call yourselves professionals?" Richard scoffed after his 5th win. "If this is the best my company has, I should fire half of you." The crowd laughed nervously, some forcing fake smiles just to stay safe. Nobody wanted to be the next victim of his ridicule. And then came a voice. It wasn't from the boardroom. It wasn't from the finance department. It came from the back of the room, from a man most people barely noticed. "Mr. Grant, I'll play you. 1 game." Heads turned. A wave of whispers swept through the lobby. Standing there was James Carter, the company janitor. James was in his 50s, his uniform slightly faded from years of use. In one hand, he held a mop. In the other, a metal bucket filled with soapy water. He had been cleaning those marble floors for over 2 decades. People walked past him every day without so much as a hello. To most, he was invisible. But not today. Today, he had stepped out of the shadows. The silence was thick, then suddenly broken by bursts of laughter. Executives chuckled. Interns covered their mouths in disbelief. Even the security guards looked stunned. "A janitor?" one employee whispered. "Is he serious?" another asked, phone already recording. Richard smirked, clearly amused. His eyes sparkled with the cruelty of a man who loved a spectacle. "Oh, this will be fun," he said, leaning forward. Then, with a grin that showed all his teeth, he added, "Tell you what, James, if you beat me, I'll marry you myself." The lobby erupted in laughter. Phones shook as people filmed the outrageous scene, already imagining how fast it would go viral. To Richard, this was just another opportunity to flex his ego and entertain the crowd. But James didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply set his mop aside, placed the bucket neatly by the wall, and walked toward the table. With calm dignity, he met Richard's eyes and nodded once. "Deal." The laughter faded into murmurs. The crowd leaned closer. The game that was supposed to be a joke was about to begin. And no one, not even Richard, realized that this janitor carried a secret that would soon shock the entire building. The janitor versus the CEO. The janitor set down his mop, wiped his hands on his uniform, and walked toward the chessboard. His eyes were steady, his movements deliberate, like a man with nothing to prove but everything to gain. Every step James took across the marble floor felt like a drumbeat. The crowd shifted, phones raised higher, whispers swirling like a storm. Nobody had ever dared to face Richard Grant without trembling. Yet this janitor walked with a calmness that unsettled even the CEO. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his smirk growing wider. That smug confidence clung to him like a custom-tailored suit. "Careful, James," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "I've crushed international champions. You sure you want to embarrass yourself in front of everyone?" James didn't answer with words. He simply pulled out the chair across from Richard, sat down, and locked eyes with him. Then, in a voice calm as stone, he said, "Make your move." A ripple of anticipation swept through the crowd. The game began. Richard started aggressively, sliding his pawn forward with the dramatic flair of a general leading his troops into battle. He played for the crowd, exaggerating every movement, glancing around for approval as if each pawn he advanced was another employee conquered. The audience chuckled, whispering, "He's toying with him." 3 moves? The janitor's about to lose in 3 moves. But James remained still, his face unreadable. He leaned over the board, not with hesitation, but with the sharp intensity of a man who saw patterns others couldn't. His fingers hovered briefly over the pieces before selecting one with precision. He moved quickly, quietly, and leaned back again, eyes never leaving the board. Richard's smirk flickered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He shoved another piece forward, once again glancing at the crowd for approval. "See this?" he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. Classic mistake. He won't last long. But some of the executives weren't so sure. Their eyes darted between the board and James, who sat with the stillness of a monk. His moves weren't random. They were exact, as if every square had already been mapped out in his mind. What most didn't know, what Richard certainly didn't know, was that James Carter had once been a name whispered in chess circles. Long before the janitor's uniform, before bills and family struggles forced him into survival mode, James had been a local prodigy. A man who had sat across boards in state tournaments, winning games in seconds while opponents scratched their heads in disbelief. Life had pulled him away from the spotlight, but the game never left him. And now, fate had placed a chessboard in front of him once again. Not in a tournament hall, but in the middle of a corporate lobby, facing a billionaire who thought him insignificant. The executives leaned closer, tension building. Phones recorded from every angle. Even the receptionists had abandoned their desks to watch. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound between the clicks of chess pieces. Richard cracked his knuckles, preparing another move, still convinced victory was his. "You're finished already," he said arrogantly. "You just don't see it yet." But James did see it. Not just the board in front of him, but the trap Richard was blind to. 3 quiet moves, that was all it would take. And today, the janitor was about to remind everyone in that building of a lesson they would never forget. Never underestimate the quiet man who knows the game better than you. The 3-move checkmate. Richard laughed, the sound booming across the lobby like the growl of a predator who thought victory was already his. He slammed his second move onto the board with unnecessary force, muttering insults under his breath. "This is too easy," he sneered. "You really thought you could stand against me? A janitor against a billionaire? You'll be sweeping floors for the rest of your life." The crowd chuckled nervously, some glancing at James with pity, others shaking their heads. To them, the outcome was obvious. Nobody, not a manager, not a vice president, and certainly not a janitor, had ever stood a chance against Richard Grant's ego-fueled chess games. But then it happened. James reached forward, steady and calm, and slid a piece into place. The soft click of wood against wood echoed louder than Richard's arrogance. The crowd leaned closer. Murmurs rippled through the lobby. Richard's grin faltered for the briefest second. He brushed it off, smirk returning, and moved another piece, still playing for show, still convinced of his dominance. But James didn't hesitate. He reached forward again, another move, deliberate, precise. This time, the murmurs grew louder. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Wait, what's happening?" And then it hit. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, his confidence draining with every second he studied the board. Something wasn't right. His king, the untouchable piece, the throne he always protected with ease, was suddenly boxed in. Every escape route he relied on was gone. His options were shrinking like water in a clenched fist. The silence in the lobby was suffocating now, broken only by the hushed voices of employees realizing what they were witnessing. One executive whispered, almost in awe, "Wait, is this a—" Another clutched his forehead, gasping, "No way. It can't be." But it was. 3 precise moves. Checkmate. Gasps erupted like fireworks. Phones shook as they recorded, zooming in on the impossible sight. Richard Grant, the untouchable, the arrogant king of the company, was defeated. And not in an hour-long battle, not in a drawn-out match, but in 3 devastating moves by the man who scrubbed his floors. The billionaire's face froze, his jaw dropping, his smirk completely erased. His skin flushed red, then pale, then red again. He blinked rapidly, as though the board might change if he stared hard enough. But the truth sat there in cold, carved wood. His king was trapped. His throne had crumbled. You tricked me." Richard sputtered, his voice cracking. This isn't possible. You cheated. You must have cheated." James didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply leaned back in his chair, calm and collected, and spoke words that sliced deeper than any insult ever could. "No, sir. You underestimated me." The weight of those words hung in the air like thunder. The crowd erupted into cheers, applause, and laughter. Employees who had once bowed their heads now roared with pride. They had just witnessed the downfall of arrogance at the hands of humility. And in that moment, James Carter, the janitor, wasn't invisible anymore. He was the man who checkmated a billionaire in 3 moves. The aftermath of the checkmate. The silence cracked open like glass under pressure, exploding into thunderous applause and cheers. The entire lobby came alive, the walls shaking with the energy of hundreds of employees who had witnessed the impossible. For years, Richard Grant's arrogance had cast a shadow over the company. People laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. They clapped at his victories, even when they were humiliations. But now, for the first time, the applause wasn't his. It was for the janitor who had humbled him in 3 brilliant moves. 3 moves? 3 moves, voices chanted, echoing from every corner. Phones shot videos, screens lit up, and laughter rolled through the crowd like a wave. Some employees replayed the recording instantly, zooming in on Richard's stunned face, already imagining the headlines that would sweep across social media. Janitor checkmates billionaire CEO in 3 moves. Richard's face burned crimson, his jaw trembling with rage and disbelief. The king of the company, the man who had mocked and belittled others without mercy, now found himself the butt of the cruelest joke of all, his own. And worst of all, his careless, arrogant bet had come back to haunt him. "Mr. Grant," one bold employee shouted, barely containing laughter, "should we expect wedding invitations soon?" The entire lobby erupted, howling with amusement. Even the executives, who usually cowered in Richard's presence, were chuckling behind their hands. Laughter had replaced fear. Joy had replaced intimidation. For once, Richard wasn't the man everyone looked up to. He was the man everyone laughed at. Richard slammed his fist on the table, rattling the chessboard, but only made the laughter grow louder. He opened his mouth to roar back, but no words came. His ego, once unshakable, was in ruins. Meanwhile, James remained the calm center of the storm. He didn't bask in the victory, didn't soak in the applause, didn't gloat. He stood quietly, like a mountain unmoved by the winds around it. With the same dignity he had walked in with, James picked up his mop, leaned on it gently, and looked Richard straight in the eye. His voice wasn't loud, but in that moment, every soul in the room heard it crystal clear. "Winning a game doesn't make me better than you, sir. Respect does. Something you might want to practice." The words struck deeper than the checkmate itself. Applause thundered again, not for the game this time, but for the wisdom behind his words. Employees nodded, some with tears in their eyes, realizing they had just witnessed not only a chess victory, but a moral one. Richard's lips quivered, but he said nothing. For once, the man who always had the last word was silent. James, however, didn't linger. He didn't wait for congratulations or handshakes. He simply placed his mop back in the bucket, straightened his shoulders, and walked away. The crowd parted for him like waves before a ship. And as he disappeared down the hall, the applause didn't stop. It followed him, growing louder with each step, as if the entire building was finally celebrating not just a janitor, but a man who had reminded them all of the most important truth. Respect is worth more than riches, and humility is stronger than arrogance. The viral legend. By the next morning, the world had changed for both men. The video, shaky from excited employees' phones, had spread like wildfire. Uploaded first to social media with the caption, "Janitor beats billionaire CEO in 3 moves." It racked up millions of views overnight. Comment sections exploded with laughter, disbelief, and admiration. Some thought it was staged. Others slowed down the footage frame by frame, breaking down James' flawless strategy. Chess masters across the internet confirmed it. The janitor had executed a brilliant and devastatingly simple trap. James Carter, the man who had been invisible for decades, was now a symbol of something greater. Humility wins. Never underestimate people. Brains over arrogance. Hashtags trended worldwide. Memes of Richard's stunned face appeared everywhere, edited onto chessboards, crowns slipping off his head, even into movie posters. Late-night comedians cracked jokes at his expense. News outlets ran headlines like, "Billionaire CEO checkmated by janitor in 3 moves. Arrogance doesn't pay." While millions admired James' calmness and quiet confidence, Richard was left to face the storm of humiliation. He couldn't walk into a meeting without someone whispering, "Checkmate." His board members, though too polite to laugh in his face, exchanged knowing glances whenever he tried to assert dominance. Investors who once admired his sharpness now questioned his judgment. And every time he opened his laptop, another article or video replayed the moment he had been beaten, not by a grandmaster, but by the man who scrubbed his floors. Richard tried to laugh it off in interviews. "Oh, it was just a friendly game," he'd say, forcing a smile. But deep inside, he carried the weight of a painful truth. His arrogance had cost him his dignity. Meanwhile, James never sought to capitalize on his sudden fame. He didn't demand promotions or bonuses, didn't beg for sponsorships or book deals. He kept showing up to work, mop in hand, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Employees who had once brushed past him now stopped to greet him. Executives who had ignored his presence now shook his hand and asked him to share his strategies. Some even requested private lessons, eager to learn the game from the man who had dethroned a billionaire in front of an entire company. James accepted their kindness with humility. He never bragged. He never gloated. He simply taught those who wanted to learn, reminding them that chess, like life, wasn't about how much money you had, but how carefully you planned your moves. The respect he had earned wasn't because of the victory itself, but because of the dignity with which he carried it. As for Richard, he changed, though not overnight. The lesson was too sharp, too public, too unforgettable. But slowly, his arrogance softened. He no longer mocked employees during meetings. He stopped using power as a tool for humiliation. Deep down, he knew he would never escape the title that followed him everywhere. The billionaire who lost to the janitor in 3 moves. And perhaps in some strange way, that was the best checkmate James had ever delivered. Not just on the chessboard, but in life. Before I reveal how the janitor shocked a billionaire CEO in just 3 moves, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you don't want to miss stories like this one.